Utah desert, winter of 1878. The air was thin and sharp, cutting through the lungs like broken glass. Underneath a cloudless, star-pierced sky, the Fairmont Valley lay silent, almost too silent. The wind carried with it the dry taste of iron and dust, whispering through the tall sagebrush that dotted the endless pale desert. From the distance, the faint outline of the Fairmont estate rose against the moonlight. An imposing Victorian mansion, its gables like jagged teeth tearing into the night sky. It was on this land, their land, where the first disappearance happened. The missing girl, her name was Clara Mayfield, a 19-year-old seamstress who lived 2 miles east of the Fairmont property. On the evening of December 7, 1878, Clara told her younger sister she was walking to the Fairmont's barn to collect some leftover firewood. She never returned. When dawn came, her father led a search party of 8 men into the desert. They followed her footprints along the dirt road leading up to the Fairmont fence line, where the tracks suddenly stopped. No signs of struggle. No blood, no torn clothing, just silence. Her father recalled something strange when they reached the property's edge. The air changed. The wind went dead still. The birds stopped. Even the ground felt different under my boots. It was like stepping onto another world. Within hours, rumors spread through the small Mormon settlement of Mapleton, whispering about the curse of the Fairmonts, a family already feared for their isolation and strange habits. The Fairmont estate. The Fairmont family had arrived in Utah in 1847, just months after Brigham Young's Mormon pioneers settled the Salt Lake Valley. But unlike the others, the Fairmonts did not integrate into the community. They built their mansion on 220 acres of farmland, surrounded by a 12-foot-high fence of dark cedar planks. At night, neighbors claimed to see oil lamps burning until dawn and hear low, rhythmic chanting carried by the desert wind. No one ever entered the Fairmont estate without permission, and those who did rarely came back the same. By 1878, the family had grown into a sprawling dynasty of nearly 40 members, all living under one roof. But there was something off about them. Their skin was unusually pale, almost translucent under the sun. Their eyes ranged from icy gray to coal black, but all shared the same glassy, unsettling stare. And strangest of all, no Fairmont had ever married outside the family. Locals whispered that their wealth, vast cotton fields, gold claims, and cattle ranches came at a cost no one dared to name. The first investigation sheriff, Elias Warren, a grizzled Civil War veteran, rode up to the Fairmont gates 3 days after Clara's disappearance. He knocked on the towering front doors and waited. When the door opened, he was met by Silas Fairmont, the family patriarch, a man of 63, tall and gaunt, with thin white hair slicked perfectly back. "Sheriff," Silas said flatly, "you have no business here." Warren pushed anyway. Behind Silas, the grand hall opened like a cathedral, lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The air was thick with the scent of camphor and bloodroot, and somewhere deep within the house came the faint cry of an infant, though Silas swore no children lived there. When asked about Clara, Silas replied coldly, "The girl never came here. This land does not welcome strangers." The unearthed Box 2. Weeks later, a farmer named Jonas Miller made a grim discovery while digging irrigation trenches just half a mile from the Fairmont property. He struck something hard buried, under 2 feet of sand, a small wooden box sealed with black wax. Inside he found human teeth, 12. Perfectly aligned, a bundle of dark hair tied with red thread, and a scrap of fabric matching the dress Clara wore the night she vanished. The sheriff confronted Silas again, this time with the evidence, but instead of panic, Silas smiled. "A thin, unnatural curve of his lips. "You shouldn't have opened it," Silas whispered. "What's buried stays buried." That night, Jonas Miller's barn burned to the ground. His cattle were slaughtered in their pens, and by dawn, Jonas himself had disappeared. Whispers in Mapleton. By the end of January 1879, 5 more townsfolk had vanished without a trace. People stopped walking past the Fairmont fence line. Parents forbade their children from venturing near the mansion. The small church in Mapleton started holding night vigils and whispered prayers against unnatural forces. A rumor began circulating, hushed but persistent. The Fairmonts are breeding something. Old diaries recovered decades later describe the unease perfectly. One entry from Sarah Kearns, the pastor's wife, reads, "The Fairmont girls, they look too alike. Their faces like reflections of each other. And the boys, their hands too long, their eyes too deep. I swear, some have no pupils at all." The night watchman's account, one of the most chilling testimonies, comes from Harvey Braddock, a hired night watchman at the Mapleton Mill. "I was walking the southern ridge when I heard it. A sound. Not human, not animal. Something between a scream and a prayer. It came from the Fairmont barn. The whole thing was shaking. And then, silence. Dead silence. I swear the ground itself was breathing." Braddock quit his job the next day and fled Utah. Before leaving, he left a note pinned to the sheriff's door. "You're looking for a girl. Stop. She's not alive. She's not dead either." The blood in the well in early February 1879. A traveling preacher named Ezekiel Boone stopped in Mapleton on his way to Salt Lake City. Boone took a room at the local inn, but 2 days later, he went missing. The next morning, the innkeeper's son discovered thick, dark liquid seeping from the old stone well behind the property. When Sheriff Warren and 2 deputies investigated, they found the well filled with blood, gallons of it, though no bodies were recovered, and carved into the well's inner stone was a single word, written backward, air. The growing. Fear by March, the entire town lived under a cloud of dread. People reported animals mutilated and left in perfect geometric patterns, footsteps circling their homes at night, but no one ever there. Whispers in the desert when the wind died down. Despite growing fear, no one dared confront the Fairmonts directly. The final scene, Section 1 cliffhanger. On March 19, 1879, a young boy named Matthew Kearns wandered too close to the Fairmont property. His mother found him standing at the fence, staring at something inside the estate. When she shook him, Matthew whispered, "They're waiting for me." And then he pointed to the mansion's second floor. Through the cracked shutters, someone was watching. Not one person, dozens of faces, all identical. The town of Mapleton could never decide when the fear truly began. Some said it started with Clara Mayfield's disappearance. Others insisted it began long before, the very moment the Fairmont family first arrived in Utah, as though they carried something ancient and unclean with them from the old world. Whatever the truth, by the spring of 1879, the Fairmont name was already poison on the tongues of the townsfolk. People spoke of them in whispers, and even then, only in daylight. The family traced their roots back to Edinburgh, Scotland, though no one in Mapleton could confirm it. The Fairmonts rarely spoke of their past. They appeared suddenly in Utah, with wealth no one could explain, purchasing vast stretches of desert farmland and immediately constructing a sprawling Victorian estate, towering walls encasing their property like a fortress. From the moment they settled, they kept to themselves, interacting with outsiders only when absolutely necessary. Over time, strange patterns emerged. The Fairmonts did not attend the local church, nor did they allow their children to play with others. Yet their numbers multiplied unnaturally fast. In less than 30 years, the family had grown from 5 to nearly 40 members, all sharing the same haunting physical traits. Unnaturally pale skin that seemed untouched by sunlight, glassy, reflective eyes in shades ranging from deep obsidian to storm gray, and faces so symmetrical it was unsettling, as if they were carved from the same mold. It was the resemblance that first drew suspicion. Each generation of Fairmont children looked nearly identical to the one before, the same elongated jawlines, the same wide-set eyes, the same unnaturally perfect teeth. Among themselves they called it the gift of purity. Outsiders whispered, a darker theory, the Fairmonts never married outside their own bloodline. In May of 1879, Sheriff Elias Warren quietly obtained copies of the Fairmont family's birth records from the county registrar. What he found made his hands tremble. Across 3 decades of records, there was no documentation of marriage licenses involving the Fairmonts, not a single one. And yet, somehow there were 17 documented births within the family. Warren began to suspect that something deeply unnatural was happening behind those towering cedar walls. He confided in Reverend Charles Brigham, the local pastor, hoping to rally community support for an investigation. But Brigham refused. The Fairmonts are protected, the Reverend said gravely. By law, by wealth, and perhaps by something else. Leave them be, Elias, for your own soul's sake. But Warren couldn't leave it alone. The disappearances, the strange sounds at night, the unearthed box of teeth, all of it gnawed at him like a fever. In secret, he began visiting the families of those who had vanished near the Fairmont estate. Their stories painted an increasingly disturbing picture. One farmer, whose eldest son disappeared while tending cattle, recalled seeing strange lights flickering across the Fairmont fields at midnight, like lanterns floating in the air. A widow whose sister vanished described hearing low chants carried on the desert wind, voices blending into a single droning hum that made her skin crawl. And then there was Thomas Keeley, a miner who claimed he once stumbled too close to the Fairmont barn after dark. I heard crying, Keeley whispered to Warren, his voice trembling. But it weren't human crying. It was deeper, heavier, like something old and suffering. I went to look, but before I reached the barn, I saw them. 4 Fairmont men standing in a circle, heads bowed, holding hands. Their lips moved in perfect unison, but no sound came out. Then one of them looked at me. Keeley swallowed hard. His eyes, there weren't nothing behind them, just black. Black like a well with no bottom. Keeley fled Utah the next day. By midsummer, the tension in Mapleton had reached its breaking point. Families began abandoning their homesteads, traveling south to Provo or west toward Nevada. The church bell rang nightly, calling the remaining townsfolk to prayer. But even inside the sanctuary, whispers persisted. The Fairmont name carried weight, not just because of their wealth, but because of something unspoken, a shared dread, a belief that their influence extended beyond human reach. Then came the journals. In late June, a wandering physician named Dr. Andrew Lyle arrived in Mapleton to treat a smallpox outbreak. One night, after drinking heavily at the local saloon, Lyle pulled Sheriff Warren aside and handed him a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with his notes from a house call he had made to the Fairmont estate 2 years prior. The first entry was dated March 3, 1877. They called me to assist a birth. The child was breech, and the mother, a pale girl of perhaps 17, had already been in labor for 2 days. When I entered the birthing chamber, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. There were no men present, only 7 women, all identical in appearance, as if they were copies of the same person. Their faces were blank, their movements synchronized. Lyle's hands shook as he described the newborn. The infant came into this world silent, its eyes open, large, black, endless. The skin was pale but strangely translucent, and when I placed my stethoscope against its chest, I heard 2 distinct heartbeats. 2. He left the estate that night and vowed never to return, but the family sent him letters afterward, polite but insistent, offering payment for his silence. Warren read the entire journal in one sitting, his knuckles whitening around the worn leather cover. By the final entry, the sheriff understood one thing with certainty. The Fairmonts were hiding something deeper than anyone could fathom, and yet, without hard evidence, he could do nothing. In July, the situation escalated. 12 miners disappeared in a single night while traveling the canyon trails north of the Fairmont property. Their campsite was discovered the next morning, fires still burning, coffee still warm in their cups, but not a single man remained. What the search party found instead was a wide circle burned into the earth, nearly 20 feet across, with strange geometric markings carved into the soil. Locals whispered that the ground inside the circle was warm to the touch, as if something beneath the desert had stirred. By now, the Fairmont mansion had become the center of every rumor in Utah County. People spoke of hidden tunnels beneath the estate, of underground chambers filled with bones, of rituals performed on moonless nights where the family purified their bloodline. No one could prove any of it, but everyone believed it. On August 14, 1879, Warren finally gathered enough deputies willing to risk entering the property. They planned the raid carefully, moving under the cover of night, carrying lanterns and rifles. As they approached the high cedar gates, a low hum filled the air, deep and resonant, vibrating in their chests. The deputies froze, exchanging terrified glances. From somewhere within the estate came the faint sound of chanting, a dozen voices, male and female, rising and falling in perfect harmony. The words were unintelligible, but the rhythm was hypnotic, pulling at something primal. In the mind, one deputy, overcome with panic, dropped his rifle and fled into the desert. Warren forced the remaining men forward. They pushed open the gates, stepping onto the Fairmont grounds for the first time. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and iron. Shadows danced across the fields as if from fires burning deep underground. The mansion loomed ahead, its upper windows glowing faintly with amber light. Somewhere close by, a child screamed, sharp and brief, then silence swallowed the sound. When they reached the barn, Warren's lantern illuminated deep scratches. Along the wooden walls, claw marks gouged nearly an inch into the timber. The doors were locked from the outside, secured by heavy chains. And from within, there came a slow, rhythmic thudding, as though something alive was pounding against the floorboards. Before Warren could break the chains, the lights in the mansion extinguished all at once, plunging the entire property into darkness. The chanting stopped. The humming stopped. Everything stopped. And then, out of the blackness, dozens of pale figures emerged from the shadows, their identical faces reflecting the deputy's lantern light. None of them spoke. None of them blinked. Warren raised his rifle, heart hammering in his chest, but something in his bones told him this was not a fight he could win. Behind the figures, a tall silhouette appeared in the doorway of the mansion. Silas Fairmont stepped forward, his expression calm, his voice low but carrying unnaturally across the still night air. "You shouldn't have come here, Sheriff," he said softly. "Our blood is not yours to police." And then, as if on some unspoken command, the entire family began to move, not walking, but gliding toward the deputies in perfect unison, their bare feet silent against the soil. Warren fired the first shot. The lanterns crashed to the ground, and the night swallowed everything. The events of that night were never recorded in the official sheriff's log. There was no mention of the raid, no reports filed, and no surviving deputy willing to speak of it openly. but fragments of the truth survived in private diaries. Old letters and a series of unsigned testimonies collected decades later, all describing the same haunting scene. When the first shot rang out, chaos erupted across the Fairmont estate. Some deputies claimed they fired into the approaching figures, but their bullets made no sound upon impact, as though striking water instead of flesh. The lanterns fell, flames licking the dry soil, briefly illuminating dozens of faces, pale, expressionless, eyes reflecting firelight without life behind them. Then came the chanting. No one saw where it started, but within moments the entire Fairmont family was speaking in unison, low voices weaving together into a single droning hum. The sound reverberated through the deputies' chests, crawling beneath their skin, making their bones vibrate. One man dropped to his knees, clutching his ears and screaming. Another turned his rifle on himself, rather than stay another moment. In that darkness, Sheriff Elias Warren later wrote in his private journal, hidden beneath the floorboards of his home, "It was not language I knew. Not Latin, not any scripture I have read. But there was order to it, a structure like music turned inside out. I swear on my soul they were calling to something, and something answered." No one remembered fleeing, but the surviving deputies awoke the next morning scattered across the desert, miles from the estate, with no memory of how they got there. 2 men were missing entirely. Their tracks led back toward the mansion, and simply stopped at the edge of the fence. Mapleton went quiet after that night. Word of the failed raid spread quickly, though no one dared confront the Fairmonts again. Families locked their doors at sunset, curtains drawn tight, refusing to speak of the things they'd seen. But strange happenings only grew worse. Over the following weeks, travelers passing near the Fairmont property reported hearing high-pitched cries carried on the wind, cries that sounded like infants, but too distorted, too hollow. Some swore they saw shapes moving beneath the earth, the soil shifting as though something massive crawled just below the surface. One evening, a rancher named Benjamin Crane saw light spilling from the second-floor windows of the mansion. Through his telescope, he described a room filled with people, their bodies arranged in a perfect circle around a wooden table. Their heads were bowed, and in the center of the table rested something long and pale, glistening under lamplight. He watched, until one of them turned toward the window, meeting his gaze directly through the glass. The next morning, Crane's cattle were found slaughtered, each animal's throat cut cleanly, their bodies arranged in a spiral formation pointing toward the Fairmont estate. It was around this time that old Mormon records first mentioned the purity gatherings, monthly rituals the Fairmonts performed on moonless nights. From the ridge above the property, witnesses described hearing voices layered in perfect harmony, their tones rising and falling with unnatural precision. Sometimes drums accompanied the voices, deep and thunderous, shaking the air for miles. No one ever saw what happened inside the barn during these nights, but there were stories, terrifying, persistent stories, of what came out afterward. A schoolteacher, Lydia Holbrook, wrote in her diary that she woke one night to find a young girl standing barefoot outside her window, her pale dress soaked through with dark stains. When Lydia opened the door, the girl whispered one word before collapsing unconscious in the dirt. Twins. The girl, later identified as one of the younger Fairmont daughters, died before morning. Her body was buried without ceremony, and her grave was unmarked. By autumn, the barn became the focal point of every rumor. Some said the Fairmonts bred animals there, livestock twisted into grotesque forms. Others whispered of infants born too early, carried from the house to the barn in silence, only for the sound of muffled screaming to rise moments later. But one account from October 1879, preserved in the diary of a deputy named Samuel Pike, remains the most disturbing. "I walked the perimeter of the estate last night. The moon was gone, the sky black as pitch. As I passed near the barn, I heard something breathing inside, ragged, heavy, wet. Then came a sound like bones snapping. And above it all, faint like a lullaby, a woman's voice singing. Pike resigned the next day and left Mapleton forever. That winter brought the first real tragedy that could no longer be ignored. A snowstorm blanketed the valley, trapping many families in their homes, but the Fairmont mansion remained strangely untouched. Days later, a group of hunters discovered a series of bare footprints leading from the estate into the deep woods. Following them, they found a clearing littered with bones, dozens of them, human and animal alike, stripped clean as if boiled. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden stake, and nailed to it was a length of parchment written in spidery black ink. Sheriff Warren kept the parchment hidden for years, but when his belongings were unearthed in 1921, the note was finally read. "The blood carries the memory. We keep it pure. We do not dilute. To dilute is to die." No one knows who wrote it, but the handwriting matched Silas Fairmont's signature. As the new year approached, disappearances in Mapleton doubled. Entire families abandoned their farms, taking nothing but what they could carry. Those who remained reported constant surveillance, shadows lingering at the edge of candlelight, faint scratching at windows in the dead of night, and soft voices whispering from the desert when no one else was near. It was around this time that an itinerant preacher named Jonathan Bell arrived, claiming he had been sent by divine vision to cleanse the land of corruption. Bell rallied a group of men to storm the Fairmont barn, believing it to be the source of evil in the valley. They entered on the night of January 6, 1880. None of them came back. 3 days later, their bodies were discovered stacked neatly inside the abandoned church, their faces covered with a fine layer of ash. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, but every corpse was missing its eyes. From that point forward, Mapleton lived in quiet terror. No one dared approach the Fairmont property again, and yet the family continued their strange gatherings, their chants rising and falling beneath the desert stars like clockwork. Even as the years passed, no one truly escaped the shadow of the Fairmont name. Travelers reported seeing pale figures wandering the roads at night, their movements smooth and deliberate, their faces unnervingly familiar. Ranchers whispered of malformed calves born with extra limbs, their bodies buried before sunrise. A schoolteacher discovered drawings etched into the floorboards of her classroom, spirals, double helixes, and symbols no one could decipher. And then came the journals. Those same journals that would later form the backbone of the investigation. Into the Fairmont's bloodline. In February of 1880, a doctor named Nathaniel Gray was hired to examine one of the Fairmont children who had fallen ill. Gray's notes describe something beyond sickness. The child's body fights itself. 2 distinct pulses, one slow, one rapid, colliding beneath the skin. I examined his lungs, 3 lobes on the right, 4 on the left. I have studied anatomy my entire life, and I swear this should not be. Gray fled Utah the next week, but his journal entries survived, locked in the archives of the Salt Lake City Historical Society. They confirmed what Mapleton had whispered for decades. The Fairmonts were not simply hiding their inbreeding, they were controlling it. Selecting bloodlines, matching siblings deliberately, tracking traits through generations, as though breeding something specific, something new. By spring, the barn stood as the symbol of everything unspoken. No one went near it, but everyone feared it. Witnesses claimed they could hear whispers seeping through the cracks of its walls, voices murmuring in patterns too precise to be random. Some nights, faint blue light escaped through the gaps in the wood, bathing the nearby snow in an eerie glow. One night, an elderly ranch hand named Joseph Harper claimed he saw a young Fairmont boy standing in the barn's doorway, cradling something in his arms. It was breathing, Harper said, but it wasn't a baby. Whatever it was It had too many eyes. The boy disappeared into the darkness, and the barn doors slammed shut. By the summer of 1880, even the whispers stopped. No sounds from the estate, no lights in the windows, no figures in the fields. It was as though the entire family had vanished, overnight. And yet, on the first night of the new moon, the chanting returned, low, steady, endless. The people of Mapleton realized then that whatever was happening inside the Fairmont estate, it was far from over. The winter of 1880 brought silence to Mapleton, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was a hollow, suffocating quiet that made every sound unnatural, every shadow suspicious. The townsfolk avoided even speaking the Fairmont name, as though saying it aloud might summon something they weren't prepared to face. But for Sheriff Elias Warren, silence meant danger. He couldn't shake the sense that something inside that mansion had changed, that the family was hiding something far worse than anyone imagined. His suspicions were confirmed when a stranger arrived one frozen morning. Dr. Nathaniel Gray stepped off a worn stagecoach, his coat heavy with dust, carrying a leather case under his arm. He had been summoned by a letter written in perfect, elegant handwriting, sealed with black wax. The signature was unmistakable. Silas Fairmont. Dr. Gray had heard the rumors, of course. He'd dismissed them as rural hysteria until he saw the mansion for himself. Its dark, towering gables loomed against the pale winter sky, its cedar walls aged but unbroken, its windows shuttered tight as if the house were holding its breath. He was greeted not by servants, but by two Fairmont sons, tall and silent. Their faces mirror images of each other, their eyes void of warmth. Inside, the air was thick and strangely humid despite the winter chill outside. The grand hall smelled faintly of camphor and something sweet, almost metallic. Oil paintings of Fairmont ancestors lined the walls, each rendered in uncanny detail. Dr. Gray paused before one, a woman from the early 1700s, her features nearly identical to those of the Fairmont daughters he would later meet. Silas greeted him personally, his presence commanding yet cold, as though his flesh was little more than a vessel. "We require discretion," he said without preamble. "There are things here that outsiders wouldn't understand." The doctor was led upstairs into a small windowless chamber. There, on a narrow bed, lay a boy no older than 8. His breathing was shallow and uneven, his skin almost translucent beneath the lamplight, faint blue veins tracing patterns like roots beneath the surface. Dr. Gray pressed his stethoscope to the boy's chest and froze. 2 heartbeats, one fast, one slow, each distinct, colliding beneath the ribs in a rhythm no human body should sustain. Gray asked questions, but Silas only smiled faintly. "He is one of our finest," he said softly, brushing a strand of pale hair from the boy's face. "Perfection comes at a cost." Dr. Gray's journal, recovered years later, describes his growing horror in painstaking detail. The boy's lungs, he discovered, had 7 lobes instead of 5. His pupils dilated unevenly, reacting not to light but to sound. When Gray pricked his finger for a blood sample, the boy did not flinch, and the wound sealed itself within minutes. "I have studied physiology my entire life," Gray wrote, "but what I saw defied every principle of medicine. These children are not merely the product of intermarriage, something else is shaping them." After the examination, Gray was escorted to the lower levels of the mansion. He was led down a narrow spiral staircase that disappeared beneath the main hall, the air growing damp and cold as they descended. At the bottom, a corridor stretched into darkness, lined with iron doors bolted from the outside. Behind one of them, Gray heard soft, wet coughing, followed by a sound he later described as like 2 voices tangled in a single throat. When he asked what was inside, Silas replied simply, "The imperfect ones." Gray was given a room to sleep in that night but found little rest. Through the thin walls, he heard faint chanting, voices rising and falling, perfectly synchronized, every syllable drawn out until it dissolved into a low hum. At times, it sounded as though the house itself was breathing around him, the wood expanding and contracting with each exhale. In the early hours before dawn, something woke him, a creaking sound, followed by soft footsteps in the hallway. He cracked the door open just enough to see a pale figure gliding past, one of the Fairmont daughters, her hair loose, her expression vacant. She clutched a bundle tightly against her chest, something small swaddled in dark fabric. Gray followed silently at a distance as she descended into the lower chambers. At the end of the corridor, she entered a room lit by a single oil lamp. Through the crack of the door, Gray caught a glimpse of glass jars lining the walls, each filled with cloudy fluid. Inside floated tiny, distorted forms. Infants, or what should have been infants, their limbs twisted, their skulls too large, their empty sockets staring through the amber liquid. The girl placed her bundle on a metal table and began humming softly, the same haunting tune Gray had heard in the halls above. He backed away silently, returning to his room and locking the door. In his journal, he wrote only one sentence before dawn. They are trying to make something. When Gray confronted Silas at breakfast, the patriarch did not deny it. "We carry the memory," Silas said calmly, slicing his bread with precise strokes. "Others dilute. They weaken their line. But we ascend." Gray pressed him, demanding to know why the children suffered. Silas's expression darkened. "Suffering is irrelevant," he said. "What matters is survival." That afternoon, Gray attempted to leave the estate, claiming he needed to retrieve medical supplies from town. As he neared the main gates, two identical Fairmont sons blocked his path, their faces expressionless. One of them placed a hand on his chest and whispered a single word in a language Gray did not recognize. The next thing he remembered was waking, up in his room, drenched in sweat, the son long gone. His medical case sat open beside him, though his tools had been rearranged into neat, precise patterns he didn't remember making. Gray left the estate the following morning, refusing payment. But before he departed, Silas handed him a small leather-bound notebook. Inside were diagrams, dozens of them, detailing measurements of skulls, blood ratios, genetic traits, and symbols resembling ancient alchemical signs. The final page contained a single line, handwritten in Silas's script. "We do not worship God, we build him." Gray fled Utah the next day, abandoning his practice entirely. In the months that followed, reports from those living closest to the Fairmont property grew increasingly strange. Farmers claimed their livestock gave birth to malformed calves with translucent skin and multiple hearts. Two hunters swore they found a field littered with bones arranged in spiral formations, each spiraling inward toward a shallow pit lined with black stones. By March of 1880, another 6 people had vanished without a trace. Among them was Jonas Fletcher, a trapper who kept meticulous records of his travels. His journal was discovered years later in a cave near the edge of Fairmont land, its final entry written in frantic scrawl. "I heard the voices again. Not from the house, from beneath the earth. There's something moving under the desert. I saw the ground ripple, like breath. Whatever's under there, it's big, and it's awake." In early April, a powerful storm swept through the valley, tearing down fences and uprooting trees. Afterward, townsfolk discovered that part of the Fairmont fence line had collapsed, revealing a narrow path leading to the farthest reaches of their property. A group of curious men followed the trail until they reached a small stone structure, half buried in the earth. Inside, they found rows of crude wooden coffins stacked against the walls, each marked with a single symbol resembling a double helix. One coffin had been pried open, its lid splintered. The bones inside were wrong. Too long, too thin, the skull warped into unnatural angles. Among the remains lay scraps of black cloth embroidered with a spiral sigil identical to the one carved into the old town well months earlier. Word of the discovery spread fast, and with it, fear gripped Mapleton tighter than ever. The church began holding nightly vigils, candles burning without pause, prayers murmured in low voices. But no one could shake the growing belief that the Fairmonts weren't simply guarding secrets. They were creating something. And whatever it wasn't meant for the world beyond their walls. Sheriff Warren became consumed by the mystery. He spent sleepless nights poring over Gray's notes, old county records, and testimonies from anyone willing to speak. The more he uncovered, the more he understood that this was not madness, not superstition. It was deliberate. The Fairmonts were engineering their bloodline, shaping it generation by generation, perfecting traits they believed would elevate them beyond human. But something had gone wrong. Those kept in the lower chambers, the imperfect ones Silas spoke of, weren't discarded entirely. They were studied, dissected, their remains preserved in jars like trophies. Warren began to suspect that the Fairmonts were close to something, some culmination of decades of breeding and ritual, but he could not fathom what it was. On the evening of April 17, 1880, the sheriff received an anonymous note slipped beneath his door. The handwriting was shaky, smudged with dirt, and what appeared to be blood. The note read, "They're gathering tonight. If you want to see what they've built, come to the barn after midnight. Bring no light. Bring no gun." Warren hesitated, but his obsession outweighed his fear. As the town slept, he crept through the desert toward the looming silhouette of the Fairmont barn, its roof jagged against the starlit sky. The chanting had already begun, low and steady, vibrating through the earth beneath his boots. He pressed himself against the barn's outer wall, peering through a narrow crack in the wood. Inside, he saw them. The sheriff's office in Salt Lake City was nearly silent that evening, the smell of kerosene lanterns thick in the air. Outside, a dust storm hissed softly against the wooden walls, carrying with it the constant low howl of the Utah winds. Sheriff Elias Harland sat hunched over a stack of reports, his heavy hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. 12 men, 12 experienced miners. Gone. They'd left 3 days ago to prospect along the rocky ridges bordering the Fairmont estate, lured by whispers of silver veins buried deep within the shale cliffs. They were men who understood danger, men who knew the mountains, men who carried rifles and dynamite and the unshakable stubbornness of survivalists. Yet by dawn on the 4th day, their camp was found abandoned, tents ripped open, tools scattered, supplies untouched. No footprints leading away, no signs of struggle. Only a single drag mark in the dirt that stopped abruptly, as though whatever had pulled them had disappeared into thin air. The first deputy on the scene vomited at what he found next, a patch of ground stained black with dried blood. Elias had sent 2 more men to investigate further, but they came back pale, refusing to go near the ridges again. There were claw marks carved into the stone itself, long, deep, unnatural grooves that no animal in Utah could have made. Whatever happened out there wasn't an accident, wasn't a landslide, wasn't even human in its violence. The whispers started almost immediately. Locals in Fairmont Valley claimed they'd heard screams echoing through the canyons the night. The miners vanished. Not just human screams, something layered beneath them, something guttural, feral, almost inhuman. Some said the Fairmonts had cursed the land to protect their bloodline. Others whispered about the old legends, stories of malformed children hidden beneath floorboards, kept alive but never allowed to walk in sunlight. The Mormon preachers told their congregations to stay away from the cliffs entirely. But Elias knew better. He'd been sheriff for 20 years, and in those 20 years, the Fairmont estate had been at the center of nearly every unsolved disappearance within 30 miles. A farmhand gone missing here, a traveling merchant's wagon found abandoned there, always near their land, always unanswered. This time, though, 12 men had vanished at once. There'd be no silencing this. By sunrise the next morning, Elias put together a search party of 6, himself, 2 deputies, a doctor named Elias Whitlock, and 2 volunteers from town who had nothing to lose. He didn't trust the Fairmonts to allow them near their property, but he didn't care. They weren't asking. As they climbed the shale ridges, the air grew colder, thinner, quieter. There was no bird song here, no rustling of small animals. Even the wind seemed hesitant to pass through. It was the kind of silence that made men whisper without realizing it, their voices dampened by something unseen. They reached the miners' camp around noon. The tents still flapped weakly in the breeze. One lantern lay shattered, blackened glass scattered across the dirt. Elias crouched low, his boot sinking slightly into the soft, disturbed earth where the blood had pooled. He brushed the surface with his gloved hand, revealing faint drag, marks leading toward the ridge wall. Whatever it was, Deputy Crane muttered behind him, it took him that way. Elias followed the marks to where they stopped abruptly at the stone face. The claw marks were real, 4 parallel gouges, each as wide as a man's thumb, running deep into solid granite. Mountain lion, one of the volunteers whispered, though his voice trembled with disbelief. Elias shook his head slowly. A lion don't leave marks like that. Dr. Whitlock knelt by the rock, running his hand along the grooves. He measured one with his fingers, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. These weren't made with claws, he said softly. They're surgical, clean, precise. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They pressed on, following the ridge until they found something worse, far worse. Just beyond the cliffside, half buried beneath shale and dust, they uncovered a shallow pit filled with bones, dozens of them. The remains were tangled together like a nest, ribs twisted with femurs, skulls cracked and piled atop one another. But it wasn't just the number of skeletons that froze the men in place. It was what they looked like. Some of the skulls were normal, human, adult, others were not. Whitlock lifted one carefully, brushing dirt from its surface, his breath sharp and ragged. The skull was small, malformed, the jaw too narrow, the eye sockets disproportionately wide, and where there should have been a forehead, there was none. The bones sloped backward unnaturally, almost animalistic. Good God, Whitlock whispered, nearly dropping it. These aren't all human. Elias said nothing. They kept digging, uncovering smaller skeletons, some no larger than a rabbit, with bones fused in unnatural ways, spines bent like twisted rope. A few still had scraps of rotted cloth clinging to them, as though they'd been wrapped and buried deliberately. Children, Crane breathed, his voice shaking, or something pretending to be. The doctor wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. These are genetic anomalies, he said finally. This isn't nature. Someone made these. Elias turned to him sharply. Made? Whitlock nodded grimly. Interbreeding, forced mutation, something's been experimenting. The word hung heavy in the silence. And then, just as they began to cover the pit again, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was humming. Low, rhythmic, deliberate. The men froze, listening. The sound was coming from deeper within the cliffs, beyond a narrow crevice they hadn't noticed before. Without waiting for orders, Elias drew his rifle and led them forward. The passage opened into a cavern, damp, cold, and heavy with the stench of rot. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, some smeared with what looked like dried blood, In the center of the cavern sat a crude altar made from stacked stones, and atop it lay a collection of objects none of them understood. Jars filled with cloudy fluid, bones carved into spirals, and a book, thick, leather-bound, its cover mottled with age and moisture. Whitlock stepped forward cautiously, opening the book with trembling hands. Inside were sketches, drawings of fetuses, diagrams of organs, detailed notes written in code. Some pages depicted human figures with elongated limbs, double rows of teeth, and hollow, eyeless sockets. Others showed surgical instruments and instructions for incisions. The handwriting was precise, clinical, almost obsessive. Elias didn't need to ask whose it was. The initials on the inside cover said it all. R. Fairmont, 1862. Before anyone could speak, a sound echoed through the cavern. Faint footsteps, deliberate, slow, coming from somewhere behind them. The men turned as one, rifles raised, and from the darkness beyond the altar, a figure emerged. It was tall, hunched, draped in a long, tattered coat. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, its hair thin and stringy. But it was the eyes that froze Elias in place, wide, glassy, reflecting the lantern light in a way no human eyes should. The figure smiled slowly. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice cracked and hollow. "They don't like visitors." Then, somewhere deeper in the cavern, something screamed, high-pitched, distorted, wet, and the walls began to tremble. Elias turned to his men. "Run." But by the time they reached daylight, two were already gone. The night settled over Fairmont Valley like a heavy shroud, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and decay. Sheriff Elias Harland sat on the edge of his bed, boots still on, rifle propped against the wall. His hands trembled as he tried to roll a cigarette, the paper tearing again and again beneath his fingers. He hadn't slept since returning from the cliffs. Not after losing two men in that cursed cavern, not after seeing those bones, and not after hearing whatever screamed in the dark. But what gnawed at him most wasn't the cavern. It was the book. R. Fairmont, 1862. The handwriting was neat, elegant even, but the diagrams inside were nothing short of monstrous. Pages of twisted anatomy, organs rearranged like pieces of a puzzle, instructions for breeding protocols, notes on deformities and viable offspring. He'd seen enough blood in his lifetime to stomach almost anything, but these sketches, these weren't just medical. They were deliberate, planned, generational. And for the first time in 20 years, Elias felt something close to fear of the Fairmonts. Outside, the night wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it a strange sound, faint at first, almost imagined, like someone humming off key in the distance. He froze. It was the same melody they'd heard in the cavern earlier, low and rhythmic, but now it drifted from somewhere behind his cabin. He grabbed the rifle and stepped into the dark. The moon hung high, spilling pale silver across the valley. The trees swayed softly, their shadows crawling across the ground like restless spirits. Elias followed the sound through the dry grass until he reached the hill overlooking the old Fairmont estate. The house stood silent in the distance, its once grand silhouette decaying under the weight of time. The windows were boarded, but Elias could swear faint light flickered behind them. And then, just as he started toward it, he noticed something else. Movement. A small figure darted along the tree line behind the house, crouched low, moving, fast on all fours. It stopped suddenly, turning its head toward him. Even from that distance, Elias saw its face. Pale, hairless, the jaw unnaturally wide, the eyes too large and shining like wet glass. Then, in a motion almost spider-like, it vanished into the undergrowth. Elias didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, he returned to town and gathered a handful of men he trusted, Dr. Whitlock, Deputy Crane, and a grave digger named Samuel Pike, who knew the valley's soil better than anyone alive. By dawn, they were riding toward the back of the Fairmont property, where rumors spoke of old family burials. The Fairmont graveyard wasn't marked on any map. There was no iron gate, no stone markers, just a quiet stretch of land overgrown with sagebrush and brittle weeds. The earth here was uneven, sunken in strange patterns, as though the ground itself rejected what lay beneath it. Samuel Pike dismounted first, pulling off his hat and kneeling low to inspect the soil. "See this?" he said, dragging his calloused fingers through the dirt. "Fresh disturbance, less than a month old." Whitlock frowned. "But there are no markers. Who would they be burying out here?" Elias tightened his jaw. "That's what we're gonna find out." They dug for nearly an hour before striking something hard. Wood, rotted and damp, crumbling beneath the weight of their shovels. The coffin was small, too small. Crane hesitated. Child's coffin? Whitlock knelt, his gloved hands prying. Opened the warped lid. Inside, beneath a thin layer of dirt and mold, lay a body, or something close to one. At first glance it looked like a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old. But as the dirt fell away, its features came into view. Pale, skin stretched tight over malformed bones, jaw slightly crooked, arms longer than natural, and its hands had 6 fingers each. Whitlock cursed under his breath, recoiling slightly. "Dear God." Samuel crossed himself. "What in hell is this?" Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. They dug 3 more graves, each yielding the same grotesque results. Small coffins, tiny bodies, each more deformed than the last. One had an elongated skull, smooth and rounded like a strange animal. Another had fused legs, webbed together by thick, waxy flesh. One had no eyes at all, only smooth skin where sockets should have been. "This isn't natural," Whitlock said quietly, examining one of the skulls under the lantern light. "This is controlled, selected. They're trying to force certain traits and suppress others." Crane looked sick. Why would anyone do this?" Whitlock hesitated, then finally spoke. "To create something new." As the words left his mouth, a low moan carried through the trees, soft, broken, almost human. The men froze. From the edge of the graveyard, something moved. Shapes began emerging from the tree line, crouched low, silent, watching. At first, Elias thought they were children, maybe 5 or 6 of them, pale and small, their faces half hidden behind matted hair. But as they stepped closer, the lanterns caught their features. Sunken eyes, uneven jaws, skin mottled like bruised fruit. One of them hissed softly, the sound clicking deep in its throat. Samuel stumbled backward, fumbling for his rifle. "What the hell are they? Don't shoot!" Elias snapped, raising a hand. Not yet. The figures didn't attack. They just watched, swaying slightly, their heads tilting in unnatural synchronization, as though responding to some silent command. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they retreated into the shadows, vanishing back into the tree line like smoke dissolving in the wind. The men stood in silence, breathing hard, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. But the night returned to stillness. Whitlock broke the silence first, his voice trembling. "Elias, we're standing on a breeding ground." The sheriff stared at the open graves, his grip tightening on the rifle. "This doesn't leave this valley," he said finally. "Not yet." But deep down, he knew they were already too late, because buried beneath those unmarked mounds wasn't just the past. It was the future, and it was waking up. As they packed up their tools, Whitlock wrapped one of the malformed skulls carefully in cloth and tucked it into his satchel. He wanted answers, and he knew where to find them. In the book. That night, back at his study, he spread the Fairmont journal across his desk and began decoding the strange looping script. Hours passed, his candle burning low, until he found the passage he'd been searching for. Generation 6 complete, 6 viable forms, 3 rejected. The hum grows stronger. Soon their bodies will adapt fully. Soon we will leave behind what binds us. Whitlock read the line again and again, his skin cold, his heart pounding. Leave behind what binds us. By the time Elias arrived at Whitlock's home the next morning, the doctor was pale, drenched in sweat, and trembling. There, not just breeding for deformity, Whitlock whispered, pushing the journal toward him. They're evolving. Elias frowned, scanning the diagrams, elongated spines, widened rib cages, increased cranial capacity. Notes on vocal resonances, bone density optimization, and something chillingly labeled Phase 7 complete divergence before. Elias could ask. A scream cut through the morning air, high, sharp, ragged. It came from the woods. The sheriff grabbed his rifle and ran, Whitlock close behind. As they reached the tree line, they saw smoke curling into the sky from somewhere deep on Fairmont land. Something was happening at the estate, and Elias knew, with a sinking dread in his chest, that the missing miners, the malformed children, the strange symbols carved into stone, it all led back there, to the Fairmont house, to whatever waited inside, and this time there would be no turning back. The wind clawed at the valley as Elias Harland and Dr. Whitlock rode hard through the thinning woods, their horses' hooves pounding against the cracked earth. Dawn barely touched the horizon, but the smoke was already visible, a thick grey column rising above the tree line, twisting like a living thing. The Fairmont estate was burning, or something inside it was. Neither man spoke as they rode. There was no need to. Both knew that the fire wasn't an accident. When they reached the clearing, Elias reined his horse to a sudden stop. The Fairmont house loomed ahead, silent and hulking, its blackened windows staring like hollow eyes. The smoke wasn't coming from the house itself, but from somewhere behind it, beyond the overgrown orchard. Elias could hear something faint beneath the crackling of flames, chanting, low and rhythmic, rising and falling in strange cadences. Whitlock swallowed hard. That's not English. Elias said nothing. He dismounted, rifle in hand, boots sinking into damp earth as they moved toward the sound. The orchard was dead, every tree stripped bare, branches skeletal against the pale morning light. The deeper they went, the louder the chanting became, until they reached a clearing surrounded by leaning wooden fences, half buried in moss. In the center of the clearing, a pit yawned open, wide and deep, its edges lined with crude symbols, carved into stone. The smoke rose from it in spirals, black and oily, stinging their eyes. Around the pit stood 6 figures cloaked in dark, tattered robes, their faces hidden, each swaying gently to the rhythm of the chant. And behind them, cages. 4 iron cages stood stacked against the fence, covered in burlap and rope. Something moved inside them, small shapes shifting, limbs pressing weakly against the fabric. One cage rattled suddenly, violently, before going still again. Whitlock gripped Elias's arm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Those aren't animals." Elias stepped forward, his rifle raised, when one of the robed figures turned sharply toward them. A pale, skeletal face emerged from beneath the hood, its skin waxy, its lips thin and cracked. Its eyes glimmered, strangely in the half-light, too large, too round, reflecting the fire like wet glass. The figure spoke, its voice rasping like dead leaves dragged across stone. "You shouldn't have come here. Elias steadied his rifle. Step away from the cages. The figure tilted its head unnaturally far, like an owl, the movement wrong, alien. Then, without warning, it smiled. The chanting stopped. The remaining robed figures turned in unison, revealing their faces, all pale, all strangely elongated, their jaws slightly unhinged as though reshaped by forces not meant for man. One raised a hand, palm scarred with strange symbols, and pointed directly at Elias. "You dig up what should have stayed buried," it whispered. "Now the soil takes you back." From the pit came a sound. It started low, a deep rumble, then rose into something almost human, a long, ragged scream that made Elias's skin crawl. Whitlock stumbled backward, eyes wide, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Elias turned his rifle toward the pit, just as something began to climb out. At first, he thought it was a man, but as more of it emerged, the shape became wrong. Its limbs were too long, its spine curved unnaturally, its skin gray and smooth, stretched tight over jutting bones. Its head was hairless, elongated, with no nose and a mouth lined with small, needle-like teeth. It hauled itself onto the edge of the pit and crouched low, its body twitching violently, spasms rippling beneath its skin, as though something inside was struggling to break free. Whitlock whispered hoarsely, "Elias, this is what they've been making." The thing moved suddenly, fast, impossibly fast, launching itself across the clearing with inhuman strength. Elias fired, the rifle's blast shattering the quiet, but the shot barely slowed it down. It collided with one of the robed figures, tearing into the man's throat with wet, ripping sounds before flinging the body aside like broken glass. The other robed figures didn't scream. They didn't even move. They simply watched, swaying slightly, as though this violence was expected. Elias fired again, aiming higher, and this time the shot tore into the creature's neck. It stumbled, shrieking in a sound so high-pitched it rattled their teeth, then collapsed against the dirt. Its body convulsed once, twice, and then went still. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the soft rustling of the cages. Elias lowered his rifle slowly, his breath ragged, sweat stinging his eyes. Then one of the burlap-covered cages moved again, violently this time, and a sound came from inside. A whimper, high and thin, unmistakably human. Elias ripped the covering away. Inside, huddled against the cold iron bars, were 3 children, at least. They had once been children. Their faces were twisted, bones misshapen beneath fragile skin. One boy's arms were too long, ending in thin, claw-like fingers. A girl's eyes were set wide apart, unblinking, reflecting the firelight with an almost animal brightness. The smallest one rocked back and forth, humming softly. The same off-key melody they had heard in the cavern days before. Whitlock knelt beside them, his voice breaking. "Dear God, they're alive." The surviving robed figure stepped forward, lowering its hood fully now. It was an old man, his skin pale and stretched thin, veins pulsing beneath the surface like blue rivers. His lips trembled as he spoke, his voice cracked and weak. "They are the 6th generation," he said softly. "The soil chose them." Elias raised his rifle. "Who are you?" The old man smiled faintly, revealing teeth filed down into sharp points. "We are the bridge," he whispered. "Between flesh and what comes after, the Fairmont blood is the key." Before Elias could respond, the old man dropped to his knees and began chanting, louder this time, his voice rising in strange, broken syllables. The ground shook again. Whitlock grabbed Elias's arm, pulling him back. "We need to leave, now." But it was too late. From the pit, more shapes began to move, clawing their way up from the dark. Not one this time, not 2. but dozens. Small twisted forms crawling and writhing, their pale limbs slick with black earth. Their mouths opened in unison, releasing a low, vibrating hum that rattled the air like a swarm of locusts. The children in the cages began humming too, matching the sound perfectly. Whitlock stared, horrified. They're calling to each other. Elias fired again, shattering one of the crawling things, but more kept coming, their bodies relentless, their movements jerky and unnatural. He grabbed Whitlock's arm, pulling him toward the trees. Run! They sprinted through the orchard, branches, tearing at their clothes, the humming following them, growing louder, surrounding them. Behind them, the chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a single piercing scream, human, pained, and final. When they finally broke through the tree line and reached their horses, Elias risked one glance back. The clearing was swarming now, pale shapes moving like a tide around the pit, crawling over the robed figures, dragging them down into the dark. The old man was gone. Whitlock mounted his horse, hands shaking violently. "Elias," he gasped, "this isn't just a family, it's a colony." Elias stared at the black smoke curling into the sky, the faint hum still vibrating in his bones. "No," he said softly, tightening his grip on the reins. "It's a hive." They rode hard back to town, knowing the fire wouldn't burn away what they'd seen. Because whatever was inside that pit wasn't dying. It was multiplying. The first thing Elias noticed when they rode into Hollows Creek was the silence. The town was usually alive at this hour. Blacksmiths hammering, wagons creaking, children running barefoot through the dusty streets. But now there was nothing. No chatter, no barking dogs, no sound except for the slow creak of their horses' saddles and the distant caw of a crow circling above the church steeple. Whitlock wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the windows lining Main. Street curtains twitched here and there, faces briefly peering out before disappearing again. "They know," Whitlock whispered, his voice hoarse. "Somehow they already know." Elias said nothing, but he felt it too. A pressure in the air, as though the whole town was holding its breath. He steered his horse toward the doctor's office, intent on gathering supplies before they decided their next move. But as they dismounted, a sound broke the heavy silence. A wet, hacking cough. Both men turned sharply toward the source. Across the street, an old woman hunched in a rocking chair on the porch of a boarding house, her thin body shaking violently as she coughed into a blood-stained handkerchief. Her skin was pale, almost grey, and when she looked up, Elias's stomach tightened. Her pupils were dilated, swallowing nearly the entire iris, and thin, dark veins crawled beneath her skin like ink spreading through water. "Help," she rasped, her voice raw and broken. "Please, it's inside me." Whitlock ran to her, kneeling at her side, but Elias stopped a few feet back, scanning the street around them. A door slammed shut somewhere nearby. A child's thin wail carried faintly from inside a house before being abruptly silenced. Something was wrong here. Deeply wrong. Whitlock gently pulled the handkerchief from the woman's trembling hand. It was soaked through with a dark, viscous fluid thicker than blood. He touched it, rubbed it between his fingers, and then recoiled as though burned. "This isn't sickness," he muttered. "This is something else." Elias turned toward him sharply. "The pit," he said, his voice low. "It's spreading." Before Whitlock could reply, the old woman let out a strangled scream and convulsed violently, her back arching so far it looked as if her spine might snap. Her jaw unhinged with a sickening pop, her breath rattling as a low hum escaped her throat, a sound Elias recognized instantly. It was the same sound the children had made in the cages. Whitlock stumbled backward, his hand slick with her blood, as the woman's body went rigid and then collapsed, lifeless, onto the porch. The silence that followed was short-lived. From the side streets came the sound of more coughing, deep, wet, choking coughs, followed by screams, one after another, rising and falling in waves. Elias turned toward the noise. Just as a man staggered into view, his face ghostly pale, his shirt soaked with sweat. His arms hung unnaturally limp at his sides, and his eyes were wide, unblinking. "Help us," the man whispered, his voice barely audible, before collapsing, face first into the dirt. Whitlock rushed to him, but Elias caught his arm, holding him back. "Don't touch him," he warned. "Whatever this is, it's moving fast." A sharp, metallic bell began ringing from the church at the far end of town. The heavy, desperate sound echoed through the streets, and within moments people began to emerge from their homes, some stumbling, others running, their faces pale with terror. "Inside," a man shouted from the church steps, waving frantically. "Get inside now! Seal the doors!" Elias and Whitlock exchanged a glance before hurrying toward the church with the crowd. The air felt thicker with every step, heavy with the scent of burning wood and something else, something acrid, like rotting meat mixed with copper. Inside the church it was chaos. Families huddled in pews, mothers clutching their children, men shouting over one another as the priest tried in vain to calm them. Candles flickered wildly, throwing long shadows across the walls, while someone nailed boards over the windows. Elias and Whitlock pushed their way to the front where the priest stood, his face pale and drawn. "What's happening here?" Elias demanded. The priest hesitated, glancing nervously at the crowd behind him before leaning close. "It started last night," he whispered. "People waking up with fevers, coughing up black bile. By morning, 3 families were dead, and—" his voice faltered. "And some of the bodies, they moved." Whitlock stiffened. "Moved?" The priest nodded slowly. "We buried them, but the ground wouldn't keep them." Elias gripped the edge of a pew, his knuckles white. His thoughts went back to the pit, to the chanting, to the pale things crawling from the dark earth. This wasn't an infection. It was a transformation. A scream tore through the church, sharp and sudden. Elias spun around just in time to see a young boy collapse in the aisle, his small body shaking violently. His mother knelt beside him, sobbing, as his skin took on the same grey pallor as the old woman's. His breathing turned ragged, and then, just like before, the humming began, low and vibrating, crawling beneath the skin. Within seconds, 3 more people joined in, their voices merging into an unnatural droning harmony that filled the air like a swarm of bees trapped inside the walls. Panic erupted. People screamed, shoved, and ran for the doors despite the priest's desperate pleas. A man swung his axe against the boarded windows, splintering the wood, before Elias tackled him to the ground. "We can't go out there," Elias shouted over the chaos. "If this is coming from the Fairmont land, it's already in the air. You leave this church, you die faster." But even as he said it, he knew the church wasn't safe either. Whitlock crouched beside the boy, his hands trembling as he checked his pulse, but he recoiled when the child's eyes snapped open. The pupils were gone now, swallowed by blackness, and his lips peeled back into a faint, unnatural smile. "Elias," Whitlock whispered. "He's changing." The boy's small frame contorted violently, bones cracking beneath the skin, fingers stretching unnaturally long. His humming grew louder until it became a shrill, piercing sound that shattered one of the candle holders above them. Then he stopped moving altogether. For one terrible moment, the church fell silent. And then the boy opened his mouth and screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was layered, multiple tones weaving together, deep and high-pitched at once, vibrating through the wooden floorboards. People clutched their ears, crying out in pain, while the candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching unnaturally long as though drawn toward him. The priest made the sign of the cross, murmuring frantic prayers under his breath. But the boy's scream only grew louder until suddenly the church doors burst open. 3 men stood silhouetted in the doorway, their clothes torn, their faces streaked with dirt and blood. Behind them, the street burned, several houses engulfed in flames, black smoke rolling into the pale sky. One of the men stumbled forward, collapsing against the altar. His shirt was soaked with the same black fluid, and as Elias tried to lift him, he rasped out a single broken phrase before going still. "They're under us." Elias froze, staring down at the lifeless body. Then he felt it. Faint, but undeniable. The floor was vibrating. Whitlock's head snapped up. "Elias, it's not just the Fairmont land, it's beneath Hollows Creek." Almost as if responding to his words, a loud crack splintered through the church, the wooden boards beneath their feet bowing upward. Screams erupted as people scrambled toward the doors, pushing and trampling one another in blind panic. Elias grabbed Whitlock's arm, hauling him toward the back of the church just as the floor gave way in the center aisle. From the darkness below, pale shapes clawed their way up, their gray skin slick with earth, their limbs jerking in unnatural spasms. Some were small, childlike. Others were tall, bent-backed creatures whose faces bore faint, horrifying echoes of the townsfolk they'd once been, and all of them hummed. The sound shook the air, a living frequency that seemed to bypass the ears and burrow directly into the bones. Elias raised his rifle, but even as he fired into the swarm, he knew they were surrounded. The hive had already spread. The tunnels were older than the town itself. Elias had always heard stories. Whispers passed between miners and drifters about the ancient passageways that stretched beneath Hollows Creek, carved by hands long forgotten. But he never believed them. Not until now. He and Whitlock stumbled into the dark passage beneath the collapsed church floor, their boots sinking into damp soil as the last screams above were swallowed by the earth. The air was thick, wet and cold, carrying the stench of rot and something sweeter, something sickly, like overripe fruit left to decay in the sun. Behind them, the tunnel entrance trembled violently, boards crashing down to block the way back. Elias turned and fired once, twice, trying to keep the pale creatures from following, but their jerking limbs clawed through the debris, their blackened eyes reflecting the weak light of his lantern. "Move," he barked, pushing Whitlock ahead. "Don't stop for anything." The narrow passage twisted into darkness, roots dangling from the ceiling like skeletal fingers. Water dripped steadily from somewhere far above, echoing faintly in the silence. The hum was still there, faint now, but constant, vibrating through the soil, crawling into their bones. Whitlock's breathing was ragged, his boots scraping against stone. Where are we even going?" "Down," Elias replied without looking back. "Always down." They moved quickly, but the tunnel seemed endless, each turn revealing another fork, another slope deeper into the black. More than once, Elias thought he saw movement in the shadows ahead. Brief flashes of pale, thin limbs retreating into side passages, like they were being herded rather than hunted. Eventually, they reached a wide chamber where the tunnel walls opened into an underground cavern. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, and shallow pools of stagnant water reflected faint glimmers of light from phosphorescent growths along the stone walls. Whitlock stopped at the edge of the chamber, bracing himself against a slick boulder. His voice trembled. This ain't natural, Elias. This whole place feels wrong." Elias scanned the chamber, his rifle raised, before kneeling to touch the damp earth near his boots. The soil was warm, unnaturally. So, beneath his hand, the ground seemed to throb faintly, like the steady rhythm of a distant heartbeat. He cursed under his breath. "It's spreading faster than I thought." Then came the sound. A single low note reverberated through the cavern, deep bone-rattling, like the groan of a distant mountain shifting beneath the earth. It rolled through them, vibrating in their chests, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Whitlock backed against the cavern wall, his hands clutching his ears. What the hell was that? Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. From one of the side tunnels, pale figures emerged, half a dozen of them, their movements jerky and unnatural, their jaws twitching as low hums escaped their throats. Their grey, wet skin glistened in the faint light, and as they stepped closer, Elias saw their faces. Some he recognized. There was Mary Thatcher, the school teacher, her once kind smile twisted into a grotesque mockery as her jaw hung slack. There was old Cooper, the blacksmith, his massive frame bent and contorted, his hands gnarled into claws. "God help us," Whitlock whispered. Elias raised his rifle and fired, the echo tearing through the cavern. One creature fell, but the others barely flinched, their bodies jerking like marionettes under unseen strings. Then the hum changed. The frequency deepened, reverberating through the cavern walls, until Elias felt his teeth ache. Whitlock dropped to his knees, clutching his head and screaming as blood trickled from his nose. The creatures stood perfectly still now, their black eyes fixed on the two men, their bodies vibrating faintly in rhythm with the sound. Something was calling them. Elias grabbed Whitlock by the collar and hauled him toward another tunnel, forcing him to run even as the hum grew louder, chasing them like a wave. The passage ahead twisted sharply, and suddenly the ground dropped away into a steep slope. They slid down together, tumbling into another cavern, their lantern shattering against the rocks. For a moment, the world was darkness. Then Elias heard it. Not the hum this time, but something else. A wet, clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing faintly through the cavern. He fumbled with his matches, striking one until a small flame flared to life, and when he lifted it, his breath caught in his throat. They were standing on bones, thousands of them layered so thickly that the floor crunched beneath their boots. Skulls, ribs, femurs, human and animal alike, tangled together in a grotesque carpet of death. Whitlock's voice broke as he whispered, "Jesus Christ." Elias crouched, lifting one of the skulls. It was clean, too clean. Stripped of every trace of flesh, polished smooth as though something had been feeding on it. And then, from the far side of the cavern, came another sound, breathing, slow, wet, and impossibly deep. Whitlock raised his lantern high, his hands shaking, and the faint light revealed a massive shape half hidden in the shadows, a wall of pale, glistening flesh fused into the stone itself. Veins as thick as ropes pulsed beneath its surface, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. At its center, something shifted. The flesh peeled back like a flower blooming in reverse, revealing a face. Or what once might have been a face. Its features were warped and stretched, the remnants of human eyes and a mouth twisted into something unrecognizable. The hum intensified, shaking dust from the cavern ceiling, and Whitlock fell to his knees, gasping for air. Elias felt the vibration, crawling through his bones, clawing at his skull, forcing thoughts that weren't his own into his mind. Images flashed behind his eyes, the pit, the bodies, the dark earth opening like a wound. And beneath it all, a voice, low and endless, whispering in a language he didn't understand. The thing in the wall was speaking to him. He staggered backward, firing blindly, but the bullets sank into the pulsating mass without effect. The hum grew louder, so loud it felt like his ribs might crack from the pressure. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. From the shadows behind them came the soft shuffle of feet. Elias turned just as a group of pale figures emerged from a tunnel, their movements synchronized, their black eyes glinting faintly in the weak light. But this time, they didn't attack. They knelt. One by one, they dropped to their knees before the thing in the wall, bowing low until their foreheads touched the bone-covered floor. Whitlock grabbed Elias's arm, his voice breaking. "It's not just a hive," he whispered. "It's worship." Elias stared at the creatures, at the pulsating mass fused into the stone, at the thousands of bones beneath their feet. "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's worse than that." Because deep down, he understood now. This wasn't some disease. It wasn't an infection, a curse or madness. It was a colony, and somewhere beneath Hollow's Creek, something ancient had been waiting, feeding, growing. And now, it was awake. The air was heavier now, thick and damp like breathing through wet cloth, carrying with it the coppery tang of blood and the sour stench of rot. Elias leaned against the slick cavern wall, his chest heaving, sweat rolling into his eyes and stinging, the raw cuts across his face. Whitlock knelt nearby, hands pressed to his temples, whispering fragmented prayers under his breath. Behind them, the humming had quieted, but it wasn't gone. It never truly stopped. It was deeper now, slower, like the measured pulse of something vast and alive beneath the earth. The silence around them wasn't safety. It was anticipation, the pregnant pause before something unthinkable. Elias steadied himself, forcing the rifle strap higher on his shoulder. "We keep moving," he said, his voice a low rasp. "We find another way out, before it finds us." Whitlock didn't answer right away. His bloodshot eyes darted toward the passage they'd come through, toward the pale shadows kneeling in worship around the thing fused into the stone. That wasn't human, Elias," he muttered finally, his voice breaking. "That thing in the wall, God help us, it spoke to you." Elias didn't respond. He didn't want to, because deep inside, beneath the fear, he already knew Whitlock was right. The words, if they could even be called words, were still there, burned into his mind like scars. Images of dark soil splitting open, of 1,000 pale limbs clawing their way toward the light, of something ancient pulling strings too deep to see. They followed a narrow passage branching off from the cavern, ducking beneath low arches of stone slick with condensation. Their boots crunched softly on the uneven floor, scattering tiny bone fragments with each step. Roots as thick as wrists hung down like wet ropes, brushing their faces, and somewhere distant, faint dripping echoed endlessly, after what felt like hours. The tunnel widened again, opening into another cavern, this one smaller, but stranger. At first, Elias thought the walls were moving. Then he realized it wasn't the walls at all. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of pale, slug-like organisms clung to the stone, writhing faintly, their translucent bodies pulsing as fluid moved beneath their skin. Thin, vein-like tendrils reached from each of them, weaving together into a dense network that spread across the cavern, burrowing into the rock itself. Whitlock gagged and stumbled backward. "Jesus Christ Almighty! What is this?" Elias crouched low, studying one of the organisms near the ground. Its body swelled and contracted in slow rhythm, and inside its translucent form he saw something small, curled, twitching faintly like it was dreaming. A child. No, not a child. Not anymore. Before Elias could react, one of the organisms split open with a wet, tearing sound. Thick, dark fluid spilled onto the floor, steaming faintly where it touched the cold stone. From within, something pale and frail clawed its way out, its small fingers digging into the earth as it dragged itself free. Its black eyes blinked open, glassy and unblinking, locking immediately onto Elias. Whitlock stumbled backward, raising his lantern high, but the newborn thing didn't attack. Instead, it turned its face toward the far end of the cavern, where the passageway plunged deeper into darkness and let out a sharp, high-pitched trill, a signal, a call. Then the hum returned. Not distant this time, not faint. It was here, vibrating through the floor beneath their boots, rattling their bones, crawling up their spines. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with it, the network of veins glowing faintly with a sickly reddish light. Elias grabbed Whitlock's arm. "Move," he growled, dragging him away from the writhing walls. "We have to get out before they—" He stopped. At the mouth of the next passage stood a figure. It was taller than any human, its pale body stretched unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in sharp, bone-white tips. Its head tilted slightly, unnervingly slow as though studying them. When it stepped forward, its bare feet made no sound on the stone, and behind it, more figures emerged, one after another, filling the tunnel with a silent procession of pale, black-eyed things. Whitlock raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked. Like thunder, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, but the creature didn't fall. The bullet lodged in its chest, but instead of bleeding, the wound simply closed around the metal, swallowing it whole. Then it spoke. Not with words, not truly, but with sound. A low, layered frequency that bypassed their ears entirely, burrowing straight into their skulls. Elias dropped to one knee, clutching his head as visions flooded his mind. He saw vast underground chambers stretching for miles beneath the earth, filled with writhing nests of pale creatures stacked in endless layers. He saw rivers of dark, viscous fluid flowing through carved channels, feeding something deeper below. He saw humanity, their towns, their cities, their children, bound together by invisible threads like insects caught in a spider's web. And then he saw the heart. Deep beneath it all, beyond stone and earth and time itself, something immense pulsed in the darkness, a single colossal organ beating slow and steady, feeding life into this ancient hive. The vision snapped away as Whitlock grabbed Elias's shoulder, dragging him toward another side passage. They ran blindly, the hum following them like a predator, louder now, closer. Behind them, the pale figures moved in perfect silence, matching their pace without effort, their unblinking eyes reflecting faint glimmers of phosphorescent light. The tunnel dipped sharply, forcing them to slide down slick stone until they spilled into a massive underground chamber. Here, the ceiling vanished into darkness, and towering stone pillars rose like the ribs of some long-dead titan. At the center of the chamber stood something Elias couldn't comprehend at first. A vast, spiraling structure made of bones, flesh, and stone, fused together into an unnatural tower that reached toward the unseen ceiling above. Whitlock froze, his voice trembling. "What in God's name is this place?" Elias stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on the tower. Between the interwoven bones he saw movement, small pale shapes crawling in and out, whispering in low, broken hums. The entire structure seemed alive, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the heartbeat beneath the earth. And then he understood. This was the nursery. Every organism on the walls, every pale, slug-like sac, every newborn creature clawing its way free. They all came from here. At the base of the tower, half buried in the wet earth, lay something worse. Rows upon rows of human corpses, their flesh peeled away in strips, their rib cages cracked open and emptied. But their skulls were intact, hollow eye sockets staring endlessly into the dark. Whitlock stumbled forward, gagging, his hand clamped over his mouth. "Oh God, Elias, this ain't just feeding, this is harvesting." Before Elias could answer, the hum shifted again, deeper, sharper, almost angry. The bone tower vibrated violently, and the sacks clinging to the walls began to rupture one by one, spilling hundreds of pale, twitching newborns into the chamber. The ground beneath them shook. From somewhere far below, impossibly deep, came a single, slow, drawn-out breath, and Elias finally understood the truth. This wasn't the hive's center. It was just the entrance, the real heart of it. The thing feeding this endless cycle of creation and consumption was still below them, buried in darkness, older than the mountains themselves. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, forcing Elias and Whitlock to their knees, their skulls splitting with pain. The newborn creatures writhed toward them, hundreds of tiny hands clawing across the stone, while the pale figures from above closed in silently from every direction. There was no escape anymore, because they weren't trapped in the hive. They were part of it now.